The Richardson household operated with military precision, but beneath its polished exterior lay fractures that would take years to fully understand. I'm Ella Richardson, 27 years old, and for most of my life, I lived in the shadow of my younger sister, Lyra, the golden child who embodied everything our father valued in a daughter. Our modest colonial home in Fairfield, Connecticut, looked ordinary from the outside, but inside, it functioned like a small barracks. Dad, James Richardson, had retired as an Army colonel after 30 years of distinguished service, bringing military discipline home with him in every sense. Morning inspections of our bedrooms, precisely scheduled family activities, and dinner conversations that sounded more like briefings than casual family time. Dad stood tall with shoulders always squared, his salt and pepper hair maintained in the same crew cut he'd worn since West Point. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding troops, and his rare smiles were rewards Lyra and I competed for like medals. The Richardson legacy is service, he would remind us at dinner, his eyes invariably settling on Lyra with unmistakable pride. Honor, duty, country, those aren't just words, they're our family values. Mom, Catherine, had been a military nurse when she met Dad. Though she'd hung up her uniform to raise us, she maintained the efficiency and composure of her nursing days. She was gentler than Dad, but deferred to his authority in most family matters. Her quiet support was consistent, though I often wished she'd advocate more strongly when Dad's expectations became overwhelming. Lyra, 2 years younger than me, seemed designed from birth to fulfill our father's military dreams. While I buried myself in books, she was scaling trees and organizing neighborhood kids into mock battalions. By age 6, she could recite military ranks in order. By 10, she was winning youth physical fitness competitions that Dad would attend with beaming pride. Lyra's a natural leader. He'd tell his military buddies who visited, Richardson blood through and through. I was different. Where Lyra was athletic and commanding, I was thoughtful and analytical. My battlefield was the classroom, and my weapons were words and ideas. I excelled academically, learning to find validation in perfect test scores and teacher commendations since they rarely came from home. The pattern established itself early, when I won the regional spelling bee in 7th grade. The family celebration was brief before conversation turned to Lyra's upcoming JROTC drill competition. When I was selected for the National Honor Society, Dad nodded approvingly before asking Lyra about her physical training progress. One memory stands out with particular clarity. I was 16, studying at the kitchen table for AP exams, while Lyra practiced field stripping and reassembling a training rifle in the living room. Dad sat beside her with a stopwatch, calling out times and suggestions. Ella, he called over his shoulder, come watch your sister. Now that's a skill that builds character. I joined them reluctantly, watching Lyra's confident hands navigate the metal components with practiced ease. Try that with your textbooks, Lyra teased, finishing with an impressive time. Dad laughed. Different strengths, I suppose. The words seemed conciliatory, but his tone made clear which strengths he valued more. The only person who seemed to truly see me was my grandfather, Arthur, Dad's father, a World War II veteran with quiet dignity. Grandpa Arthur visited monthly, bringing books that fed my curiosity about the world. Unlike my father, he asked questions about what I was learning and thinking. The military needs all kinds of minds, he told me once when I confided my feelings of inadequacy. The soldiers on the ground, yes, but also the thinkers, the analyzers, the ones who see patterns others miss. Something in his eyes suggested he knew this from experience, though he rarely spoke about his war years beyond basic facts. Your grandfather had a different kind of service, Mom mentioned once while folding laundry. Not all of it in uniform. When I pressed for details, she simply smiled. Some stories aren't mine to tell. My high school graduation should have been my moment. As valedictorian, I delivered a speech on the importance of finding one's own path to service words aimed directly at my father, though I doubted he understood the message. The polite applause felt hollow compared to the family celebration that erupted days later when Lyra's acceptance to the Air Force Academy arrived. "A Richardson back at the academy," and Dad announced at an impromptu party, inviting neighbors and military friends. Carrying on the tradition, I stood in the corner, my college acceptance letters to Georgetown, Harvard, and Yale sitting unopened on my desk upstairs. I'd already decided on Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, but in that moment, watching my father's genuine pride in Lyra, I wondered if any academic achievement would ever measure up in his eyes. "They'll see your worth one day," Grandpa Arthur whispered, appearing beside me with a glass of lemonade. "Some contributions can't be measured in medals and ribbons." I couldn't know then how prophetic his words would become. Georgetown University opened a world of possibilities I hadn't dared imagine. The School of Foreign Service challenged me intellectually, while Washington, D.C. exposed me to the complex reality of global politics beyond textbooks and theory. I threw myself into my studies with the same discipline I'd learned at home, but redirected toward international relations, political theory, and languages. Russian came naturally to me, followed by Mandarin and Arabic. While other students complained about the rigorous language requirements, I found comfort in the structured patterns of new communication systems. "You have an ear for nuance," my Russian professor noted after class one day, "and a memory for details most students miss." During my junior year, I was selected for an intensive summer language immersion program. What my family didn't know was that the program was partially sponsored by government agencies scouting talent. My analytical abilities and language skills had caught attention beyond academia. The recruitment was subtle at first, a professor suggesting special research projects, guest lectures by consultants who took particular interest in my questions, casual conversations about career goals with visiting alumni whose business cards bore vague government affiliations. By senior year, the conversations became more direct. A woman named Diana Baker, with a nondescript pantsuit and perfect posture, approached me after an international security seminar. "Your analysis of information flow patterns in crisis situations was impressive," she said, handing me a business card with only a name and number. "We should discuss your career plans." 2 weeks later, I sat in a nondescript government building, signing the first of many non-disclosure agreements. The recruitment process was both more rigorous and more fascinating than I had imagined. The testing went far beyond languages and knowledge, probing my ethical frameworks, decision-making under pressure, and psychological resilience. When the official offer came, I accepted immediately. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was entering government service after all, just not in the uniform my father revered. The training facility looked nothing like I had imagined. Located on a sprawling wooded campus that could have been mistaken for a corporate retreat center, it was where my real education began. The physical training was grueling, more demanding than anything Lyra had boasted about from her military preparation. Beyond fitness were the specialized skills surveillance detection, secure communication protocols, behavioral analysis, and tradecraft basics that would keep me alive in the field. Language training went far beyond academic proficiency. I was drilled in regional dialects, slang, and cultural nuances that no university course had covered. My Russian transformed from textbook perfect to conversationally authentic, complete with regional markers that could place me from Moscow to Vladivostok, depending on the need. "Language isn't just about words," my instructor Natalie explained. "It's about becoming someone else entirely, someone who thinks in that language, who has memories and habits that align with the cover." The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect, learning to compartmentalize, to maintain cover under stress, to read people and situations with clinical detachment while appearing fully engaged. "Your family background actually helps you here," my training supervisor remarked during an evaluation. "You've been living a kind of dual existence, already meeting expectations while protecting your true thoughts. We're just refining that skill." I wasn't sure if I should feel insulted or validated by the observation, My first field assignment came after 18 months of preparation. The details remain classified, but I remember the adrenaline surge when the operation plan was approved, the meticulous preparation of my cover identity, and the strange calm that settled over me once I was in position. "You're a natural," Jessica Hayes, my colleague and eventual friend, told me after we returned. Jessica became one of the few people with whom I could be relatively honest. 5 years my senior in the agency, she became both mentor and confidant. "How do you handle it with your family?" I asked her one night during a long surveillance shift. "Badly," she laughed softly. "My mother thinks I'm an unhappy accountant with irritable bowel syndrome to explain my travel schedule and stress patterns. Mine think I'm a glorified secretary," I admitted. "My sister's in the Air Force. In their eyes, she's the one really serving." "The invisible service," Jessica mused. "That's us. Essential, but unseen. It takes a particular kind of person to be okay with that." Gilo, what I didn't understand at the time was the pressure Lyra felt to be perfect. Years later, during one of our honest conversations, she would tell me about the weight of being Dad's golden child. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to wake up every day knowing that if you fail, you're not just letting yourself down, but destroying Dad's dreams? Every fitness test, every evaluation, every small mistake felt like it would shatter his image of me." At the academy, Lyra excelled because she had to. She pushed herself harder than her classmates, volunteered for the most difficult assignments, and maintained her composure even when she was struggling internally. The confident, commanding sister I saw during family visits was partly an act of performance for Dad's benefit. "I used to look at you," she admitted, "and wonder what it would be like to have that freedom, to disappoint Dad and still be loved, to choose your own path without carrying the weight of 3 generations of military service." Her mockery of my career wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was her way of processing her own trapped feeling. If she convinced everyone, including herself, that my path was worthless, then her sacrifice meant something. But the academy taught her more than military strategy and leadership. It taught her about different kinds of courage, different ways to serve. Though she wouldn't understand the full implications until much later, seeds of respect for non-traditional service were planted during her training. The invitation to my cousin Ethan's wedding arrived between deployments, a cream-colored rectangle that filled me with disproportionate anxiety. The ceremony would be held at Fort Belvoir's Officers Club, courtesy of his fiancée, Emily's family connections. "Lyra will be there," Mom mentioned during our next call, "with her commanding officer and some colleagues. It would mean a lot if you could come too." I nearly declined. The thought of spending a weekend being reminded of my inadequate service compared to Lyra's visible accomplishments held little appeal. But something in my mother's voice, a gentle plea, made me reconsider. "I'll be there," I promised, already dreading the performance ahead. As I prepared for the wedding weekend, my professional instincts kicked in. Fort Belvoir was a significant military installation with multiple high-value targets. The presence of numerous officers at a social event created security considerations that made me unconsciously scan for potential threats. Jessica noticed my pre-wedding anxiety during our final briefing before I took leave. "You could always claim a work emergency," she suggested. "We both know they happen enough in this line of work." And reinforced that I prioritize my boring desk job over family. That would just give Lyra more ammunition. "Then go and own it," Jessica replied, her voice shifting to the tone she used when planning operations. "Treat it like field work. Prepare your cover story. Anticipate likely questions. Control the narrative." "It's my family, not a hostile intelligence service," I protested weakly. "Debatable, from what you've told me." Jessica laughed. The rehearsal dinner that Friday evening was my first family encounter in over a year. I arrived deliberately 7 minutes late, allowing me to observe the dynamics before engaging. The restaurant's private room buzzed with conversation. Family members clustered in familiar patterns. No sign of Lyra yet, a small mercy that allowed me to establish my presence on my own terms. I made my rounds, exchanging pleasantries with relatives, answering the inevitable questions about my job with practiced vagueness. Government analysis isn't as exciting as it sounds, became my mantra of the evening. Then Lyra made her entrance with military precision. She wasn't in uniform. The rehearsal dinner was technically casual, but everything about her screamed Air Force officer, from her perfect posture to her confident stride. Behind her came 3 people in civilian attire who nevertheless moved with unmistakable military bearing. The oldest, a man in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and calculating eyes, could only be Colonel Marcus Reed, Lyra's commanding officer. "Sorry we're late," Lyra announced to the room. "Base security took longer than expected." Dad immediately gravitated toward the new arrivals, his entire demeanor shifting to something more animated than he'd shown all evening. "Colonel Reed, welcome. Thank you for coming." When introductions reached me, Lyra's tone carried the faintest edge of dismissal. "And this is my sister Ella. She works in Washington too, but for a civilian agency." Colonel Reed extended his hand with professional courtesy. "Miss Richardson, a pleasure." Our handshake was brief, his grip firm and assessing. Something flickered in his eyes' curiosity, perhaps, but he moved on quickly. The wedding ceremony itself was lovely in its traditional simplicity. Ethan beamed with genuine joy, and Emily made a radiant bride. For a moment, watching them, I felt a pang of longing for a life less compartmentalized than my own. But it was at the reception that the family dynamics truly exploded. Lyra's consumption of wine passed from celebratory to excessive as the evening progressed. Her volume increased, her filter decreased, and her focus on highlighting the contrast between our career choices intensified. "You should see Ella's apartment in D.C., she announced to our dinner table. "All those fancy language books gathering dust while she types reports nobody reads." "I wouldn't say nobody reads them," I countered evenly. "Right. Sorry." Lyra laughed. "I'm sure someone files them somewhere important." And the breaking point came during the traditional toasts. After the maid of honor and best man had spoken, Lyra clinked her glass and stood, swaying slightly. "I'd like to say something about family," she announced. "Ethan and Emily, you're starting an amazing journey together, bringing together different worlds, like the military discipline we Richardson kids grew up with and the whatever normal families do." Uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. "My sister and I represent different paths, too," she continued, gesturing toward me with her glass. "I followed the family tradition of actual service, while Ella here chose alternative government employment." The emphasis made several guests shift uncomfortably. "She's just my sister who thinks typing reports is serving her country," Lyra concluded with a laugh that didn't quite mask the mockery. "But hey, we can't all be on the front lines, right? Someone has to do the paperwork." The room fell awkwardly silent. I maintained a neutral expression through sheer professional training, but internally I was calculating the fastest exit strategy. As I stepped onto the terrace for air, the cool evening breeze helped clear my head. I was practicing the controlled breathing techniques from training when my phone buzzed with an encrypted message. "Flash, priority, credible threat, Fort Belvoir, organization, Red Dawn, targeting officer event. Implement emergency protocols." My blood ran cold. Red Dawn was a domestic terrorist cell I'd been tracking for 2 years, a group with sophisticated planning capabilities and a hatred for military leadership. They specialized in targeting high-profile military gatherings. I immediately called Jessica on our secure line. "How credible is this intel?" I asked without preamble. "Very. NSA intercepted communications 3 hours ago. Multiple cell phones. Surveillance of the venue. Weapons procurement." "Ella, they're not just planning an attack, they're already in position." As if summoned by my worst fears, I noticed movement in the tree line beyond the officers' club grounds. 3 figures in dark clothing, moving with purpose toward the building's service entrance. "Jessica, I have visual on possible hostiles. I need immediate backup. Backup is 20 minutes out. Local security has been compromised. We suspect inside help." 20 minutes was eternity in a situation like this. Through the terrace doors, I could see the reception in full swing, dozens of military officers and their families completely unaware of the danger closing in. Then I heard it, the distinctive pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire from inside the building. "Shots fired," I reported, already moving. "I'm going in." Inside, chaos had erupted. 4 armed men in tactical gear had entered through multiple access points, efficiently herding the wedding guests into the main ballroom. The precision of their operation confirmed my worst fears. This was Red Dawn, and they'd been planning this for months. "Everyone on the ground," the lead terrorist shouted. "Military personnel, identify yourselves." I crouched behind an overturned table, my mind racing through tactical options. I was wearing a bridesmaid's dress and heels, not exactly combat-ready attire, but my purse contained items that could be useful if deployed correctly. The terrorists were separating military officers from civilians, zip-tying the officers and forcing them to their knees near the front of the room. I could see Lara among them, her face pale but determined, maintaining military bearing even in captivity. Colonel Reed was being singled out for special attention. "You're the highest-ranking officer here," the lead terrorist was saying. "Perfect for our message." One of the terrorists began setting up a camera, while another prepared what looked like execution equipment. This wasn't just an attack, it was going to be a propaganda execution, broadcast live to terrify other military families. I had perhaps 3 minutes before they began killing hostages. That's when training took over. I quickly assessed my resources: a tactical pen disguised as makeup, a small ceramic knife hidden in my shoe sole, and knowledge of the building's layout from my earlier reconnaissance habits. Moving with the stealth techniques drilled into me over years of fieldwork, I began systematically neutralizing the terrorists from the periphery. The first went down when I used the ceramic knife to sever his carotid artery from behind, silent and efficient. His weapon became mine. The second terrorist noticed his partner's absence and turned to investigate just as I emerged from cover. His surprised expression was the last thing he saw before my suppressed shots dropped him. But the remaining 2 terrorists in the main ballroom heard the disturbance and turned their weapons on the hostages. "Show yourself, or we start executing them," the leader shouted. I had no choice. Stepping into the ballroom with my acquired weapon, I found myself facing a tableau that would haunt me forever: my family and friends on their knees, Lyra staring at me with an expression of total shock. Well, the lead terrorist sneered. "Another wedding guest wants to play hero." What he didn't expect was my response. Instead of panic or negotiation, I moved with the fluid precision of someone who had done this before. A lot. The engagement lasted perhaps 30 seconds. When it was over, both remaining terrorists were down, and I stood in the center of the ballroom, still holding the smoking weapon, my bridesmaid's dress torn and blood-stained. The silence was deafening. Colonel Reed was the first to speak, his voice filled with recognition and respect. "Agent Echo." "I should have realized." Lyra stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "Ella, what? How did you—" "My name is Agent Echo," I said quietly, lowering the weapon, "and I work for the CIA." The aftermath was a controlled chaos of federal agents, military police, and emergency responders. FBI and CIA personnel swarmed the scene while I underwent immediate debriefing. The wedding venue had been transformed into a crime scene, with evidence teams documenting everything. My family huddled together in a secure area, still processing what they had witnessed. Dad sat ramrod straight, his military bearing intact despite the shock in his eyes. Mom held Lyra, who seemed unable to stop staring at me with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Ma'am," one of the FBI agents approached me. "We need to discuss potential security breaches resulting from your exposure." I nodded grimly. Revealing my identity, even to save lives, was a serious violation of operational security. My career was likely over, and there could be criminal charges depending on how the review board interpreted my actions. Colonel Reed, after giving his statement, made his way to where I stood. "Agent Echo," he said formally, then lowered his voice. "I was at the briefing for Operation Singapore. I know what you did there, and what you did here tonight. If anyone questions your actions, they'll have to go through me." "Thank you, Colonel, but I knew the consequences when I made the choice. The choice to save your sister's life." He shook his head. "Any decent human being would have made the same call. The bureaucrats can sort out the paperwork." Lyra approached hesitantly, still in shock. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by something I'd never seen in her before: humility. "Ella, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied gently. "All those times I mocked your job, all those things I said." Her voice trailed off as the full weight of her behavior hit her. "You didn't know. I didn't want to know," she corrected herself. "I was so focused on being Dad's perfect soldier that I couldn't see what was right in front of me." The next morning, we gathered in my hotel room for the conversation that had been years in the making. Dad sat stiffly, struggling to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the highly trained operative he'd witnessed the night before. "How long?" he asked finally. "Since college graduation, 7 years. And you couldn't tell us." I chose my words carefully. "My work requires absolute operational security. The fewer people who know, the safer everyone is, including my family." Mom reached for my hand. "The travel, the vague job descriptions, the times you couldn't be reached, all necessary for maintaining cover." Dad studied me with new eyes. "Colonel Reed mentioned Singapore and other operations. Some things I still can't discuss, even now." "But you've been serving your country all along," Lyra said quietly, "in ways that make my Air Force service look like—" "No," I interrupted firmly. "Your service is vital and honorable. Different doesn't mean less important." Dad cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried an emotion I'd rarely heard from him: regret. "I owe you an apology, Ella. I've spent years believing that the only meaningful service wore a uniform. I was wrong. The words I'd waited a lifetime to hear felt surreal in that moment." "The Singapore operation Reed mentioned," Dad continued. "What can you tell us?" I considered carefully. 3 years ago, a terrorist cell was planning to attack a Navy base in Southeast Asia. The intelligence that prevented that attack came from an operation I was part of. 37 sailors and their families didn't die because of work that happened in the shadows. The room fell silent as the weight of this revelation settled in. "And there have been others?" Mom asked. "Many others." In the weeks following the wedding, Lyra underwent a profound transformation. The sister who had spent years diminishing my achievements became my strongest advocate. She began reading about intelligence operations, learning about the vital role of analysis and covert operations in national security. "I want to understand," she told me during one of our phone calls. "I want to understand the world you've been protecting while I was too proud to see it." She also made changes in her own career. Lyra applied for a transfer to Air Force Intelligence, wanting to contribute to the kind of work that happened behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight. "You've shown me that the most important battles aren't always the visible ones," she explained when I asked about her decision. 6 months after the wedding incident, I stood in a secure government facility receiving a Distinguished Service Medal for what the citation described as extraordinary heroism in neutralizing a domestic terrorist threat. The operation had been classified, so the ceremony included only those with appropriate clearance levels. Surprisingly, my family was there, Jessica had helped arrange special one-time clearances, arguing successfully that family support enhanced operational resilience rather than compromised security. They sat in the back row, unable to hear the classified details of the commendation, but present for the recognition itself. As the medal was pinned to my jacket, I glanced toward the small audience. Mom dabbed tears with a tissue. Dad sat ramrod straight, military bearing on full display, his expression one of unmistakable pride. And Lyra, my perpetually competitive sister, rendered a perfect military salute as our eyes met. In that moment, the compartmentalized pieces of my life aligned briefly into a coherent whole. "Ladies and gentlemen," the presenting officer announced. While the details of Agent Echo's service must remain classified, I can tell you that her actions have directly prevented multiple terrorist attacks and saved countless American lives. Her sacrifice, dedication, and courage exemplify the highest traditions of service to our nation. After the ceremony, Dad approached me with tears in his eyes the first time I'd ever seen him cry. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I've always been proud of you. I just didn't understand what I was seeing." Lyra's transfer to Air Force Intelligence was approved 3 months later. During her first assignment, she worked alongside CIA analysts, including me, on a joint operation that successfully dismantled a cyber threat to military communications. "It's different than I expected," she told me after her first week. "The patience, the attention to detail, the way you have to see patterns that aren't obvious. I understand now why you were so good at this." "You're good at it too," I observed, watching her analyze intercepts with the same determination she'd once applied to physical training. Working together revealed new dimensions to our relationship. The competitive dynamic that had defined our childhood evolved into genuine partnership. We brought different strengths to the table. Her military training and leadership skills complemented my analytical abilities and field experience. "I used to think I was protecting you by keeping my work secret," I told her during one late-night operation. "I realize now I was protecting myself from having to explain choices that seemed to disappoint everyone. And I used to think diminishing your achievements would somehow make mine more important," she replied. "I was wrong about a lot of things. Thanksgiving that year was the first family gathering where I felt truly present. No more careful deflections about my work. No more feeling like an outsider in my own family's conversations about service and sacrifice. The dinner conversation included references to my recent assignment in appropriately vague terms, updates on Lyra's intelligence training, and Dad's newfound interest in learning about different forms of national service. "Arthur would have loved this," Mom said as we cleared the dinner dishes. "He always said you'd find your way to serve." Later that evening, I found myself alone with Dad in his study, surrounded by the military memorabilia that had intimidated me as a child. "I found some of your grandfather's papers after he died," Dad said, opening a desk drawer. "Things I didn't understand at the time." He handed me a folder containing documents that had been heavily redacted, but enough remained visible to confirm what I had long suspected. Grandpa Arthur had served in military intelligence during and after World War II, working in roles that remained classified decades later. "He knew, didn't he?" Dad asked. "About your work?" "I think so. He never said anything directly, but he understood the kind of service that happens in the shadows. I should have seen it myself. The signs were all there: your language abilities, your analytical mind, even the way you carried yourself after college. You moved like someone who had been trained. You saw what I needed you to see. That was the point." Dad was quiet for a long moment, studying a photo of Grandpa Arthur in his Army uniform. "I spent so many years believing that service required visibility, recognition, the approval of others. Your grandfather tried to tell me there were other ways, but I was too rigid to listen. Different kinds of service require different kinds of courage," I said, echoing something Grandpa Arthur had once told me. "Yours, Lyra's, mine, they're all necessary." As I prepared to leave that evening, Lyra walked me to my car. "I have something to tell you," she said, her expression serious. "I've been recommended for a special assignment, Joint Task Force with CIA, tracking international arms dealers. That's classified work," I said, understanding the implications. "Very classified, which means I'll be living the kind of double life you've lived for years." She paused. I wanted to ask, "How do you do it? How do you balance the secrecy with having a family?" I considered the question that had troubled me for so long. You find people who understand that some things can't be explained but still matter. You learn to be honest about what you can share and protect what you can't. And you remember that the people who love you will support your choices even when they don't fully understand them. "Like family," she said simply. "Like family." As I drove back to Washington that night, I reflected on how much had changed since that disastrous wedding 6 months earlier. The crisis that had threatened to end my career had instead opened the door to something I'd never thought possible, a life where my two worlds could coexist. I was still Agent Echo, still committed to the shadows where some of the most important work happens. But I was also Ella Richardson, daughter and sister, part of a family that finally understood that service comes in many forms. The phone call from Jessica came as I pulled into my apartment parking garage. "New assignment came through," she said without preamble. "High priority, international scope. You interested?" I smiled, thinking of the medal sitting in my drawer, the family dinner conversation still warm in my memory, and the sister who now understood the weight of classified service. "Always," I replied. "Send me the briefing." "Sati. Some battles are fought in the light, with medals and recognition and public gratitude. Others happen in the darkness, known only to those who fight them and the few who understand their necessity. Both matter, both require courage, and both deserve respect." As I walked toward my apartment, I carried with me the knowledge that I no longer had to choose between my service and my family. The secret I had guarded so carefully was no longer a barrier between us, but a bridge to deeper understanding. The Richardson legacy was service, as Dad had always said. It had just taken us all some time to understand how many forms that service could take.